Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We've got an aquatics episode this week, so what do you got teed up for us, Joe?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about flooding today, and so it's kind of a topical issue. Lots of discussions about flooding in the news, and they're happening all over the place. We went from getting a lot of calls about drought, which we've been into, and now people are starting to experience the opposite of that. We're getting too much water. So thought we'd talk about what a flood is and some of the benefits and maybe detriments of having a flood.
Yeah, that's good. Definitely a very timely topic. So are there important factors that we need to think about? What makes a flood and what's the stuff that really matters about a flood?
Yeah, a flood's just too much water. I think most people know that. And when water gets into areas that we don't want it to be, that would be flooding. And there are four main parameters that kind of drive that. The first one is timing. So when is it happening? When the temperature starts to rise and we get warmer weather that starts to melt some of the snow, we see that washing off of the mountains, and that can cause flooding in some of the streams below it. That's a really common example. Or is it, a summer flood that's related to rainfall or something like that? So timing's important. Duration, how long is this flood lasting? So is it, rising up really high and coming back down? Still can be detrimental from a human standpoint. If water gets inside of your house and floods your whole house, whether it's there for a minute or it's there for days, obviously there are some differences, but
Sure.
From an ecological standpoint, too, lots of importance in how long that flood lasts. Magnitude is often measured in discharge, so cubic feet per second, how much water is moving through an area. And that's going to depend on how wide our stream or river is, too, right? And so the magnitude would just kind of be relative to normal flow, how much flow is there. And the last one's intensity. So we generally look at intensity as a recurrence interval. And so we talk about you might hear a 5-year flood or a 50-year flood or a 100-year flood. And really what that means is how many years on average would it take for this flood to occur? So a 100-year flood would occur once every 100 years. A 5-year flood would occur once every 5 years. And so obviously a 100-year flood less likely would have more of an extreme magnitude. We'd see more flooding or more water with that situation.
Sure. Some of these floods that we've seen this year that have caused some catastrophic failure or catastrophic damage and loss of life and those sorts of things. What kind of floods were those?
Yeah, so those are flash floods that we're seeing, and that's primarily driven by rainfall. And a lot of that, the experts think that a lot of that's because of the warmer waters that we're experiencing in the Gulf and some of the Atlantic. And so that's loading up the atmosphere with more water, and it's colliding with some cooler air and dumping large amounts of rain. And so a flash flood would just be a flood that it shows up. We're not really expecting it. Water levels rise really, really quickly. And some of the examples that you mentioned with the loss of life would be it rises so fast that if you're sleeping, you don't have time to wake up and get out of the area, right? So incredibly quickly that these rivers can rise and rise really, really high amounts. And so flash flooding would be something that occurs really, really quickly. More traditional flooding would be something, a river slowly overflows its banks. Some of that is naturally occurring. Rivers used to be dynamic and exchange with wetland habitats on either side of them. We've done a good job of damming them up and putting levees on the side of them and trying to control where that water goes. But, it doesn't always stay where we want it to stay.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of the characteristics potentially of the landscape that can make flooding more likely or make it worse. What are some more things that we need to think about there?
Yeah, so understanding the surface that we have is a really big important thing. And so one of the things I think is overlooked is how many impervious surfaces we have in these areas, right? And so something like concrete, the water can't soak through that. So it's going to flow over the surface, go into a sewer system, and then wash into a river or a stream. That process happens a lot more quickly than if that same amount of water falls, in a dirt field where it can be soaked up and then slowly make its way to that stream or river. And so the amount of impervious surfaces that we have, the urban areas that we have, really can lead to some of this catastrophic flooding. What plant community that we have near a river can be really important. And so a lot of times we're cutting down a lot of the native vegetation or going in and filling in some of these areas with either non-native vegetation. Crops would be common that we see, people cropping right up to the edge of these rivers, and that on a sediment level, that makes that sediment a lot more likely to erode and can start causing problems where you can see more flooding. So things like that would definitely lead to differences in flooding.
Sure, no, it makes sense. How would you sort of combat some of that erosion and maybe reduce the amount of sediment that's going into streams? I know that can be a problem.
Yeah, a lot of that, we can do that on really small scales by just letting some vegetation grow up. And things that small amounts of vegetation, if we let it grow up, can grow large root systems, right? And so you're probably more of an expert on the terrestrial side than I am, but a lot of plants, what you see above ground, you're probably going to see similar growth below ground. And I know for a lot of native plants, at least in our area, you can cut them down about halfway. They can get grazed naturally about halfway and still keep a lot of their root structure. But if we start getting, where we're eating down more of that, or we're cutting back more, or we're cropping these areas, that root structure, underground structure, starts to get lost. And so I think establishing some of the native plants along the edge and along these riparian areas, riparian area would just be areas adjacent to the riverway, is a good way to kind of slow that down and hold some of that sediment back.
Yeah, for sure. The roots are really important for holding it, and then the above ground stuff can act as a filter too. That's beneficial as well.
Yeah, it's taking it up, it's using up some of that water, and then it's also it doesn't just take up water, it takes up nutrients. There's a lot of other benefits that we've talked about in the past with streams and our backyard ponds that having some of this vegetation. When we think about these management areas, we're thinking a lot of times subconsciously we're thinking right at the source, right? But what we're doing upstream, a mile, 2 miles away, maybe even hundreds of miles literally from where flooding's occurring, can make differences, at the source, at the aquatic source. So important to think about large landscape level management actions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you talked about dams, lack of connectedness to wetland systems in the riparian zone, and channelization as being important things. Are there any of those that it's easy to potentially remedy, or are any of those things more important or less important than the other ones?
Yeah, I don't know if there's more or less important. Understanding how it all goes together, and a lot of times we're making decisions, or we have made decisions in the past that have limited 50 years, 100 years applicability, and we're getting to the near the end of some of that. And so channelization, making rivers deeper, we've tended to make them straighter so that the water's flowing faster, and then damming up the water. We've spent a lot of money building dams in this country, and we're very good at holding water back until we're not. One of the facts that I think is really interesting is dams have cut down the prevalence of flooding, and so we see fewer areas get flooded. But when they do flood, the flooding tends to be more catastrophic. And so if we look at just a financial side of things, what we see is we have about the same, or actually even slightly more, financial loss from dams holding back that water, because now when we have floods, they're so bad, they're causing so much damage. Whereas before we may have had more frequent flooding, but they would have just caused maybe less significant damage in a lot of areas. And so that's something a lot of times it seems counterintuitive. You would think you have dams, it's going to cut back on the financial loss, but actually it's kind of exacerbated it. So just an interesting fact.
Yeah, that is interesting. I know, like thinking about our big reservoirs that we have around here, it's not super common for, let's say, Milford Reservoir to have to hang on to enough water that it floods a lot of acreage above the lake. But a few years ago, we had a really wet year, and a lot of water ended up in Milford, and they couldn't release it because of what was going on downstream in the Mississippi River. And some bur oak trees and those sorts of trees that were probably 100 years or 150 years old above the lake got drowned. And
Yeah.
so that was telling to me that, that's not a common situation if we're killing trees that have been there for that long.
Sure.
Yeah.
The Army Corps of Engineers regulates the release from pretty much every large reservoir in the United States. And a lot of that's for navigation.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're thinking about the eastern United States, what we're releasing from Tuttle Creek or Milford Reservoir that we just talked about, a lot of those releases, some of them are for flood mitigation, but some of them are just to make sure there's enough water for barges to move up and down the Mississippi or Missouri River. I think that's something that we tend to lose sight of, is the importance. Those barges are really important for our navigation and for our economy, and so keeping that flowing is really important. But, a lot of times we're only thinking about our dam being here to either, one, to go have fun on, go fishing or go boating or something like that, or two, to hold back water. So lots of other reasons that these dams are in place too.
Yeah, interesting. So you talked about intensity, duration, magnitude, all those sorts of things. What about, I've heard them talk about, some of these floods in Texas this year might have been 100-year floods or 1,000-year floods. So how you talked about that a little bit, but I mean, a 100-year flood, that's only going to happen once a year,
Yeah.
right? Or can we have multiple 100-year floods in the same area within a shorter time span?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we've seen. Intensity would be that 100-year flood, right? But the interval, how often that happens. So every year there's a 1% chance that we're going to have a 100-year flood. 1 out of 100 years, we're going to have that flood, so 1%. But that doesn't mean that if it happens this year, it's never going to happen again. You can have a 100-year flood 2 years in a row. You could have a 100-year flood 10 years in a row, right? And so those averages start to change, and we would rework what a 100-year flood is over the period of time. But that interval is what you're describing. How often do these happen? And what we're seeing is that the interval between these large floods, in a lot of cases, is decreasing. And that's for a couple reasons. One is that some of the waterways, the big waterways, the ocean seas, their temperatures have gone up over time, which adds more humidity into the atmosphere. Another thing that we're seeing is the dams that we have to hold the water back are filling in. They're aging out. And so like we've talked about just a little bit ago, when this water flows over surfaces, it's not just moving water. It's carrying with it sediment or nutrients or trash, whatever it might pick up. And when that hits the reservoir and slows down, a lot of that filters out. And so these reservoirs fill in over time. They're starting to figure out what can they do about that. As you can imagine, it's very expensive to try to fix. One of the options is to build the dam further upstream, so move the location. Another option is to clean out the dam. And so Tuttle Creek is they're running a pilot study to use something called water injection dredging, where basically they take a big fire hose and they squirt it at the bottom of the lake and the reservoir, and they try to stir up all that sediment and get it to wash downstream. So open up some of that area to hold back more water.
Well, that's interesting. I know when I used to work for Wildlife and Parks when I was in college, and I worked for the fish biologist who managed that lake, and he said it was just incredible how much Nebraska real estate ended up in the north end of Tuttle Creek after the flood of '93. Like, they went from having all of this deep water up there to, when that flood receded, all of a sudden they just had these huge mud flats up there. And that was just from one event. It was from one really, really major event, but just one event.
Yeah, when that water gets flowing, the faster it's flowing, the more power it has to grab onto that stuff. And so, how much sediment it can move is crazy. I mean, you see that. You see we get a 3, 4, 5 inch flood or 3 or 4, 5 inch rain over a short period of time. It can really wash large amounts of sediment out pretty quickly.
Yeah, we call that a toad strangler right here, Joe.
All kinds of words. I like toad strangler, though. That's a good one.
So we probably all think about the negative consequences of floods for us, property damage and potentially loss of life and those sorts of things. But what maybe negative things and also what positive things can floods have in terms of implications for terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems?
Yeah. So, I don't want to downplay the importance of the human side of things, because there are reasons that we want to control flooding. But, floods are a tremendously valuable beneficial experience for Mother Nature if we take out some of those human negative side effects. If flooding in an area we don't want it, like you mentioned, can kill a bunch of trees. That's unfortunate, but that's also part of, over time, Mother Nature might reclaim another area, and an area that had been aquatic might regrow some new trees, and that process is important too, right? And so having that transition over time, what is that called?
Ecological disturbance. So it'd be serving the same role as prescribed fire and snow and ice and those sorts of things. Scouring from floods is definitely an ecological disturbance.
And then you see secession after that, right?
Yeah,
And so that's what I was thinking about, where you kind of see it go from an early flooded, and it might turn into terrestrial habitat over time. And so seeing that, I think, is really fun. But when you have flooding, you get something called lateral connectivity, and lateral, means to the side. And so we're connecting a flowing waterway to the sides to area that's normally terrestrial. And that can provide a lot of benefits. It can provide benefits to, some of the best farm ground in the world is right next to a river. And that's because, a lot of those nutrients from the river are pushed out into those areas, those wetland areas, where all those nutrients then become available for growth. A lot of times, historically, there have been a lot of wetlands, especially further south, where those adjacent areas are really important, and they're just nutrient-rich areas. And so that's important for deposition of nutrients. So get it out of the waterways and have a place for it to go where it can be utilized. Lots of the actual physical structure of the river itself is regulated by that lateral connectivity, and so really important there. Plant community, you get dispersal of a lot of different seeds that happen in flooding. You can see it wash away some plants that might become established, and it might get rid of some of those terrestrial plants that need reset every few years, that disturbance like you're talking about, and replace them with something that likes water, right? Likes to have wet feet. And so from the plant community side, you start to see that. And then a lot of animals depend on it too. And so you can see spikes in the number of fish that are recruiting or reproducing in a certain year because they get access to these habitats. And some of those fish are, common fish that we might not care about, or most people might not, like a river carp sucker or freshwater drum. But there are also a lot of our fish that we're going out and trying to catch that utilize those habitats. There's some really big, cool fish. Alligator gar, which can be a couple 100 pounds. They can swim into these really shallow areas. When I was in Arkansas, we used to go out into fields that were flooding, and you'd see half of a gar sticking out, slithering through this muddy, flooded area and leaving behind millions of eggs, and they adhere to all the see them on soybeans or corn or whatever was flooded there, or the native habitat. So it's incredible how these animals are taking advantage of this connectivity.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I know growing up on the Neosho River, that's one that floods pretty regularly, especially with how we've channelized it and dammed it up and everything. And I remember going to Chetopa. There's a big park there below a dam along the river, and when the river got out of its banks, man, all them channel cat and blue cats would come up into the park in that area where all those night crawlers are loaded up out in the grass, and you could have a whole lot of fun catching fish where you normally might be camping, just out there when they're feeding on those night crawlers. And that's, it's just connecting that normally aquatic ecosystem to the terrestrial and providing them all kinds of food and everything that way. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, so the river can benefit the terrestrial habitat. We're depositing a lot of leaf matter, detritus, nutrients, making that really rich. But the terrestrial habitat's giving back to the aquatic system too. So that connectivity is something that I'm fascinated by. I just think it's such a cool benefit that Mother Nature's come up with. So
if I've got a pond that's close to a river or a creek, is that connectivity a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, that can be a problem. And so I've gone out and seen gar in a pond, for example, and gar are good fish. They generally eat fish that we, don't want to have large quantities of, but if they get in your pond and there's no other fish there, they're going to gobble up the fish we want to have. And so they can often introduce species that we don't want. The other thing is the fish that we want to keep in our pond might decide to go explore too. And so it really can affect your fish community. It can affect the water quality a lot in your pond, and it could be positive. It could flush it out. It could be negative. It could deposit things in there that you get an algal bloom that uses up your oxygen and leads to a fish kill. So after a flood, kind of keeping an eye on your pond and seeing what's going on is really important.
Is there anything that if my pond was flooded, beyond just keeping an eye on it, should I actively do anything or just monitor?
I think getting any type of debris that you see out of it quickly is relatively important. Obviously there's going to be physical constraints to that, but the quicker you can get that stuff out, the better. I really think keeping an eye on it, figuring out if there are fish there that you don't want, getting rid of those. If there are unwanted issues, sometimes I'll see areas that, you have a little bit of damage to your dam structure, for example. Getting on top of that quickly, like within a day or two, is immensely important. It probably can be fixed if you get to it quickly, but if you wait even a few days and let that water keep eating at it, it can quickly get to a point you can't do anything about it. Yeah. So that's something that would be what I would be on the lookout for the most. And when you have those high flow events, getting all that much water in your pond can definitely cause those catastrophic issues.
Sure. It makes that emergency spillway pretty important.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So you've talked about fish, and we've talked about kind of connectivity with terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. What other sorts of critters should we think about, in terms of benefits or challenges associated with floods?
I think that my mind tends to focus on the flooding itself, and a lot of the benefits can extend for a long period of time afterwards. And so some of these inundated habitats where the flood water was, once that flood goes down, they're still going to hold a little bit of water. They're going to be damp, and depending on the environment we're in, that could be for months at a time, right? And so those areas getting flooded, a lot of times it'll make ephemeral pools that are going to stay there for a little bit but then dry up. Those can provide really important habitats for amphibians, for example. So frogs, salamanders really can thrive in those areas. And I think, understanding some of those benefits long term, you get a lot of new growth after a flood that can benefit, I'm sure, a lot of the terrestrial critters,
Sure.
Thinking about, birds I know like to feed in those areas. There's more insects that tend to come back to those environments. A lot of insects need that aquatic environment to reproduce, and so that energy might be there. But some of the benefits of a flood happen right away, and some of them extend over time. So, that connectivity is something that used to happen regularly. We've tried to cut it down, but something we should, kind of think about the value of moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know duck hunters really like it when we have those areas that get flooded, at least that stay flooded during duck season, that they can hunt. One of the things that I had never really thought about that I saw some evidence of yesterday when you and I were at a visit at a pond is deer eating succulent vegetation that's growing out in the water.
Yeah.
I was at a habitat evaluation contest in Kentucky a few years ago, and we were out helping the kids fish at a pond one afternoon, and it was hot. And this doe came out of the woods and down into a shallow part of the pond, got about chest deep, and we watched her for a couple of hours just out there eating pondweed. But, thinking about that, she's getting water from the plants that she's eating. She's getting the nutrients from those plants that she's eating, and they're probably easy to digest, and she's also cooling off while she's out there. So yesterday when we were doing that pond visit, I noticed that there was a whole bunch of deer tracks in a couple of different places that had gone out, and you could see where the deer were browsing the plants out in the water, probably not chest deep, but probably about knee deep or so.
Yeah, that's something I look at these ponds all the time, and that's never crossed my mind. Your brain sometimes just doesn't go to those places.
Yeah.
So I figured they were going down there and drinking water, but eating all that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah. We're doing a study right now where we're taking a lot of Ceratophyllum, which is coontail, and part of the process we're drying it out, making it into a flour. We're going to feed it to bugs and see if those if those bugs, then how good of a fish food they can make,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'll make you some special cookies out of it too while we're using this coontail flour.
I don't know. That coontail smells like skunk pretty bad, so I can't imagine. That smell, I would guess, gets really concentrated as you start drying that stuff out. And then if you pulverize it into flour, man, I bet it gets in your teeth and you taste it and you smell it, and it's there with you for days. I
It's
guess.
pretty unique for sure.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me though. We'll take literally a 5-gallon bucket and maybe get a cup or two of flour out of it because there's so much water content in there. And so, hot days like this, those animals eating those aquatic vegetation, it's just like you said, another way to keep them hydrated and probably a lot of nutrition in it too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Joe, thanks for bringing the topic today, talking about flooding. It's like we said at the beginning, it's a really timely topic. It's also something that's really important across really broad areas, even pretty arid landscapes can flood sometimes, and understanding the consequences of those floods, why they happen when they do, and how often they happen, all that kind of stuff's really important. So that's and I really enjoyed our conversation today, and I look forward to what we talk about on the terrestrial side of things here in a couple of weeks.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.